I wanted to talk to you about a typo I think we brought up before. But first, Marissa mentions how you were, this is a very didactic play, and that you're talking about a lot about how creativity works and how you can use simple events in your lives as fodder for art, and how it's much more interesting. And you get the parallax of Marissa, who's sort of clueless on these things, but is still listening to Danny Wagner and is open-minded to it. And she doesn't really get it intuitively, but she can get it sort of on an analytical basis, perhaps. She's not exactly a dumb girl. She's pretty bright for the most part. And he talks about this character, Tinker, and you make a typo of Tinkerbell was the fairy that helped Pinocchio in the film. But as I told you before, I think that works. It was Peter Pan, incidentally, but because of this whole convective memory that Danny Wagner shares with you, it's just perfectly in character.
Well, I mentioned how humor can act as grease in a play. Humor also can cover a lot of sins. And also by having a style that's this sort of, my prose in a sense is sort of Whitmanian in that it flows and goes out here and there. And if you look at, for example, some of the details of the Schneider verse as they change from Bit of Golem to the New York Quartet through the Heroic Trilogy, there are things that conflict. Different characters give different takes. Probably the best long example of it is when I redo that scene between the Norwegian and the super spy from A Norwegian in the Family, and when I put it in the super spy's book, there's different names. I mean, we get probably about 95% of the same dialogue, but the name of the little girl has changed. The scenery is a little bit different. And in the same way, by having this metafictive device of characters making flaws, it's a way to avoid. It's not so much that I don't want to have a universe that's coherent, because for the most part it is. But I don't want to be one of these writers that is worrying about the little details that, if I write a quartet and in the first third of the first book I talk about a pearl-handled gun with a silver rhinestone or something, and then I write about that same gun in the fourth book, I call it a pearl-handled gun with a golden rhinestone. Oh my God, he got that wrong. Who gives a fuck? It doesn't matter. It has nothing to do with it. And especially if I have another character describing it. I've talked about this before. Marilyn Monroe. If I try to describe Marilyn Monroe in say 2,000 words, you and another 199 guys around the world are going to get images of a woman that looks fairly similar from my descriptions, but they won't all look exactly alike, and they won't all look like Marilyn Monroe, and that's a good thing, because your Captain Bligh, your Sancho Panza, your Captain Ahab should be different in your minds than mine. That's one of the problems that I've always had with movies made from books, is that it's hard to get, especially if you have a star playing. If you have Orson Welles playing Captain Ahab, say, if you had him play Captain Ahab, it would be hard to read Moby Dick even 10 years after seeing the movie and not see Orson Welles in that role.
No, you mentioned that same point, I think, with music videos, of how they act as sort of like a virus to the actual song, and an image that's evoked in a lyric will be poisoned because of the music video. You'll always be associating with that. I wanted to talk, you mentioned Ahab. In the last talk, I spoke about how I recently was rereading parts of it, and how the dialogue, they sort of speak like poems, and it's a poetic realism, but there's no actual realism behind it. And it's essentially just a long poetic narrative in prose. But you have natural poesy that just comes out of the situations. I think of Danny Wagner saying, "These days everything reminds me of something else," which works in with his age, but also with just his way as an artist.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've talked about before, one of the major differences between Jessica's prose and my prose is Jessica has the most sort of naturally poetic prose line in fiction. In that sense, she's sort of the daughter of Lauren Isley, but in fiction. And she has that seemingly effortless quality to make something a description with just a turn of a word or two in a say a 20 word sentence. I could do that. I certainly did that in my poetry, but because prose is longer, I've always tended to go and make these longer blocks of words and use paragraphs or even chapters, almost act like commas within or punctuation marks within a larger framework. That's most obvious in the longer books like Vincetti Brothers, the science fiction book Edge of the Shown, and A Norwegian in the Family, and even the spy book, The Super Seven. I have these long passages, and what does it serve? It seems to sometimes you would think, well, it doesn't really serve much of a purpose. That scene where the spy is walking along the railroads in the spy book, and he comes across the old man and the boy, and then a little bit later he comes across a bear. Well, what does that really mean? Could that scene be cut? Well, dramatically, maybe it could be cut in terms of what actually happens, since it has no seeming relevance to the 3 or 4 major strands, but it gives a deep insight into the character. And when you know that we have a character that is capable of wondering about this bear in this Fellini-like moment, that depth is in the reader's mind and carries over through this character, through some of the other areas where it's not as overtly poetic. And in the same way, in a play like this, I can write something that Marissa Miller, and I think the Marissa Miller character is a great character, but she's a great character in that she's a great good character. Not that she's a sweet virginal character or whatnot, but she's a character that's very easily relatable to the audience, unlike some of the other female characters that I've had, the Janie Fitzes and whatnot. And well, anyway, that's I forgot my point, but